This is a topic I covered previously when it comes to so-called space shuttles with NASA. Not just NASA in the US, also the Buran when it comes to the so-called competitor, Russia or the Soviet Union. And again, the Buran, which basically means blizzard or snowstorm. It's a very long story, but basically this is a replica copied from the US and the plans that were taken from the US to construct their own space shuttle. But nonetheless, getting back to the space shuttle itself when it comes to NASA, and obviously when you take a look at them, they are, quote, aerodynamic, and for something supposed to go into outer space where there's no air, it doesn't make sense with the design. When you take a look at NASA's official website, the Glenn Research Center discussed the topic, as you can see here, regarding space shuttles as a glider. So basically what it comes down to, during descent, the space shuttle flies as an unpowered glider. But take a look at the wings. There's absolutely no way this so-called space shuttle can act as a glider with those very small wings. Basically re-entering the so-called atmosphere from space, coming back down to Earth as a glider. Absolutely no way. You can take a look here, once again, at NASA's official website, and they go into detail about the space shuttle itself. Basically, how you see the jet engines in the back, they're only used one time, and that's to supplement the rockets as they supposedly make their way into space. Absolutely no way. And basically, if you look at this, the details from NASA's official website, once again, they basically talk about that. During ascent, thrust is provided by the 3 space shuttle main engines. At the base, the orbiter and the 2 solid rocket boosters. They are joined to the orange, of course, external fuel tank. The solids are jettisoned about 2 minutes into the ascent, and the fuel tank is jettisoned as the shuttle enters Earth's orbit. So there are no propellants available to the SSMEs during descent, and though the engines are still present, the shuttle returns as an unpowered glider. So again, doesn't make sense whatsoever to have these engines in the back, supposedly, again, just assisting during the initial launch into space. And the reason we've seen over the years, specifically back in the 80s and the 90s, when it comes to these so-called space shuttles, they hitch a ride on these NASA planes here, as you see, these Boeing-type planes, and also with the competitor, the Russia or Soviet Union back in the 80s, doing the same exact thing. Because again, these do not propel themselves as airplanes. They're basically gliders. And just like you see here with an actual glider, with the very small body and these extra large wings, and here is a side-by-side with a glider and an actual airplane, a Piper Cherokee, and obviously you see the wing difference. And to believe, again, that this so-called space shuttle, which is, again, is nothing more than an airplane, actually acts as a glider coming back from space to Earth, absolutely no way with these very, very small wings. Now, with the actual launch of Space Shuttle Discovery, you can see during takeoff, as you see here, the thrusters are used. They are utilized. Again, this is supposedly to supplement the actual rocket taking off. You can see the very flat horizon in the back. And supposedly, again, this is the only time that a space shuttle uses those back rocket engines to take off, again, to help supplement the initial launch before supposedly going to outer space. And of course, it just basically nothing more than expensive firework as it makes its way up, and it does this huge arc and ends up in the Bermuda Triangle, as I mentioned many times. And you see, again, the arc as it's making its way towards the Atlantic before dumping into the ocean. There's no doubt whatsoever, once again, there's no way this is going to so-called deep space as a low Earth orbit. To play a little bit more of this as you see the last of this so-called launch into space. Obviously not. You see the space shuttle making its way down before going to the ocean. Of course, they're going to cut off at this point for the millions and millions of people throughout the world that watches this stuff and actually believes these rockets, and specifically the space shuttle in this case, supposedly goes to space. You see it's making its way down. No way. This is a low Earth orbit. It's making its way again into the ocean. Now, and obviously it's impossible for rockets and so-called space shuttles to go into outer space. Basically, there's no deep space. All we have is inner space. Like it states in the Bible how God created the sun and the moon, and they're both within the firmament, as you see here. So this is something people might say, oh, this is just a depiction. But let's take a look at our reality. It definitely matches what the Bible states, where you see the daytime moon within God's firmament, not in deep space. Definitely matches our reality. And again, when it comes down to it, when it comes to NASA so-called space shuttles, they are aerodynamic, like I stated earlier, because all they are airplanes. And here's a perfect demonstration with the space shuttle coming in for a landing. You're going to hear the Doppler effect take place. And those are definitely jet engines. That's not a glider coming in for a landing. And I know what people are going to say on the globe side of things, that is basically the chaser planes that we see here in the back. And that's to disguise the fact that, again, that the so-called space shuttles are actually airplanes. And let's take a look here at the Buran itself, as it's piggybacked on top of this very large airplane. And again, the whole entire purpose of this is because these so-called space shuttles, along with the Buran, do not have jet engines. They just act as gliders. And so what's the entire purpose of this as we move forward and look at something very revealing? And you see the Buran on this tarmac, on this runway, as it makes its way down. And definitely you see the jet engines without a shadow of a doubt. Just take a look here at what we're going to see. Very interesting for a so-called glider that's basically going to take flight, as you see here. So without a shadow of a doubt, these so-called space shuttles are nothing more than airplanes. And there you see the chaser plane with basically this drill. And this is just one piece of footage that I came across, but there's also additional footage of the so-called space shuttles taking off, again, as airplanes, obviously. And as you can see here, more of the same with the Buran, as it's taken off once again like an airplane. And no doubt whatsoever, the U.S. and the so-called competitor, the Soviet Union, working together as a team, just like they did back in the 60s and 70s, as far as this so-called space travel. And it's just clever editing throughout the years that they give the general public information that's fed, that's cropped and presented in a certain way to give the public the impression they're actually going into deep space. And obviously they're not. And here's just more of the same here with the Buran, with the so-called launch into space. Again, the same thing as the U.S. Identical programs, just for a different audience. One for the Westerners and another for those, again, in the Soviet Union, to make them believe that so-called space travel is possible, when definitely cannot happen. Cannot go into deep space, because there is no deep space. As we all know that follow my channel, we live under God's created firmament.